Welcome everyone to the latest episode on Don Quixote de la Mancha. Today we cover chapter 9, which is the most diegetically complex chapter. And to kick us off, Kia, you've volunteered to recap what you can of the narrative of this
Yeah.
particularly odd chapter.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the chapter is like a discussion, which I'm sure we'll get to later. Like, there's lots of interesting things that get said, so like I won't point out everything, but basically it starts with this like last time on Don Quixote moment where it's like kind of like a flashback to what was happening at the end of the last chapter, which is like this, it does feel like this very cliffhanger moment where they both have swords above each other's heads and it's like, what's going to happen now? And then they're like, yeah, and if like it was set up that they could have split each other in half like a pomegranate or una granada, which I thought was an interesting description. It was like very visceral. And then yeah, thereafter he sort of talks of he's like, oh yeah, and then we don't really know what happened after that. We lost it to history, and then sort of talks about like recording history for a while, and then he talks about like the histories of knight errantry. And then he moves on to talk about like Don Quixote's legacy and like specifically and he talks about like the scribes who they'd have to like invent to record these histories and whatever. And then like at some point he sort of changes and he's like, well, actually, I did actually find out how the story ended, and this is how it goes. And then he sort of talks about being in, I think it's El Cana de Toledo. What's like the
Yes,
other
I can't remember the exact name, but you're right. He's somewhere in the market of Toledo. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like I think it's like a fortress, so it's like kind of a square, and they're in the market. And he says he sees like a little boy, and the little boy is handing out pamphlets. And he says because of his particular bent, he wants to read everything that he sees. So then he goes to take the pamphlet, and he finds out that the pamphlet is not in Spanish, and that it's in Arabic, and so that he needs to go find a translator to translate it into Spanish for him, which he says is quite easy. There's lots of people who are willing to do that for him. Um, and then yeah, he gets it translated, and then as the guy is like sort of reading through the pamphlet, he starts laughing, and in the laughter. He's like, oh, but what are you laughing at? What's it all about? And then it's this joke about the Lady Dulcinea, and her talent for salting pigs, um, which I don't know what means. I think we might have discussed it. It was like a callback, I think, to the description of her earlier, but I can't remember what it means. Um, yeah, but basically, he realizes in this relay that the pamphlet is about Don Quixote, and it's like this discovered piece of history, but it's like a whole bunch of printed or written pamphlets that are being handed out. So it's like this weird thing. And then he sort of buys all of the pamphlets off the kid and sort of says that it's like a bargain. And then he asks the same guy that he originally approached to translate the whole thing into Spanish, and then sort of thereafter starts commenting on the the history that's relayed from the Arabic perspective, which is quite he's not very nice about it. And then thereafter he does tell you what happens, and basically he relays the history, and he says that there's this crazy blow from the Biscayan, and it could have killed him, but it doesn't because his sword like slightly goes off, and then it like takes off a piece of his shoulder, I think, and then also knocks his helmet off and takes a bit of his ear with it. And then in response, Don Quixote kind of delivers quite a devastating blow in that it puts him like this very awkward position where he could just die. So he basically like wins the fight. And then before he delivers the blow, the two ladies that are by are like, please just spare this man. And then he's like, okay, yeah, that's fine. As long as you send him back to Dulcinea and have her be the decider of his fate. Um, and then they're like, yeah, of course we'll do that. And then he's like, oh yeah, I'll take you at your word. And that's sort of how it ends. Um,
Yeah, very complete summary, given how little there is of pure narrative here. So thank you for that. And you're quite right. We often do say this at the beginning of these discussions that there isn't a lot that happens here, but genuinely in this case, there really isn't much in terms of narrative that does. But
Mm,
the it's in terms of the narrative style, the narrative techniques of Don Quixote, the most complex chapter by far.
mm,
And actually one of the most complex chapters really in literature in general because of a lot of the questions it raises, the way in which
mm,
Cervantes starts making us question what the reality of the story is, what the boundary between truth and fiction is,
mm,
and very particularly who the narrator is, because
mm,
that's something that we took for granted quite naively up
mm,
until this point. And
mm.
but before I comment on that, I'd just like to check if Tutor's got anything that he wants to say, any impressions generally about this chapter. And really, I suppose, as opposed to what we normally ask, maybe I'd be asking you more, what are your thoughts about what this chapter is actually telling us?
Mm. I think what's interesting with this chapter as a whole is that it's telling you that sort of at any point in the story, there's someone who's in control, who's guiding you through that story, right? And I think also what's interesting, specifically within this chapter, we'll get into the details, but it discusses things around history and how I think specifically also like with the kind of book Don Quixote is that how like fiction and history are often like interwoven, and it's sort of through the story that you can sort of Cervantes is sort of challenging the notions of like what is real and what isn't real in terms of like the chivalric romance and the actual history of like knights and what they do. Um, so I think that's the interesting dilemma that he explores and discusses. But he does it in such a way that like he introduces, we'll get into it, but this idea of this alternative author narrator who's saying, "Oh, I found these sort of discussions," where it's sort of giving you a perspective of the writer, but it's not of Cervantes. So I think he interweaves it quite nicely to have this perspective of what does it mean to narrate, to document, because it's sort of seen as a documentation of what happened. Um, and when you're making those decisions, how much of the story is like true or not true or things like that. So I think, yeah.
Yeah, and I think what's particularly interesting is that how people would have interpreted at during his own time is one
Mm,
very interesting question. How we interpret it in our own time is also another
mm,
interesting question because, of course, history has taken a path that, and when I say history, I really mean historiography, like the professional writing of history, has taken an empirical path that perhaps Cervantes wouldn't have foreseen. Maybe there were implications in the air. Of course, we often comment about the fact that Cervantes is living at this time. There's an well, he's living really in the midst of a widespread epistemological crisis, and you see
mm,
with the rise of Descartes, really Descartes and his followers, and then Hobbes and his followers, this dichotomy between the sort of empirical epistemologists, sorry, and the more rationalists who believe that true knowledge is anything that to depend on true knowledge we must rationally reach it based on completely incontrovertible axioms, you know,
Mm,
and and that is and what of course has happened is that with the formalization of history writing as a profession, really with Leopold Ranke, who was a German historian in the very late 18th century. So we're really getting into the fullness of modernity here. Historians start to take this much more empirical tone that is often opposed to the construction of narrative. So you'll there is of course this whole meme that historians today, for example, are very quick to knock down and to assault sort of mythological constructions of narratives, let's say nationalist myths or um, myths of identity giving, which of course in some cases has a very which of course in some cases the historian is playing a very important role here when we consider how many very dangerous ideologies, especially of the 20th century, were constructed on a false conception of history. But it also causes you to wonder, is in the historian doing this job of constantly breaking down pre-existing narratives, aren't they actually taking some of the essence and the whole purpose of studying history in the first place away? This is an interesting question I always come to this with. And I've been fortunate enough actually to meet a few academics who are working in this particular field of historiography, studying how history has come to be written. I'm going to try hand over to Kier now, but before I do, I want to just mention something that links with what both of you have said. So, Kier, you were of course talking about how rude Cervantes seems to be to Cide Hamete Benengeli. The important thing to keep in mind is that later on in the work, he several times praises Hamete Benengeli for how truthful Benengeli is.
Mhm.
I mean, we won't censor what he says here because he essentially says in this chapter, chapter 9, he says like people of his race, and I mean he's not thinking race in kind of genealogical modern terms. He's actually essentially saying of his religion, right?
Mm.
Hamete Benengeli doubtless being Muslim in the story. Uh,
Mm.
uh, he is mendacious, so he's sort of given to not telling the truth, given to lying. And then later on, of course, Cervantes relies on Benengeli being an accurate and diligent historian. So even there with the character of Benengeli, there's this whole problem of is he like how much do we can we trust in him? Because Cervantes himself has got this kind of bipolar attitude. Um,
Mm.
this ambivalence really towards him. Then I will. So I think I wanted to mention that, and then the one final thing was yes, maybe I'll hand over to you, Kier, with this that I think ties into what Tudor has said, which is who is the narrator? Because we now have a problem, which is that Cervantes seems to take responsibility for collecting together everything that makes up the story of Don Quixote. And I think we can be pretty certain of that. But then there's the question of who is the speaking voice of the narrator throughout the story? Because is Cervantes taking the text and then putting it in his own words, or is he just pretty faithfully compiling all these different texts? And when the author says things like en un lugar de La Mancha de cuyo nombre no quiero acordarme, in a place in La Mancha whose name I do not wish to recall, is that I Cervantes, or is it actually the text that Cervantes has just accessed? And then Cervantes is just kind of copying it word for word. Or, so that's one possibility, I think. Another
Mm.
possibility is that, and in fact, regardless of how we resolve that possibility, the other big question is who writes the original source that Cervantes accesses for chapters 1 through 8? Because now at least we've got, from here on, it's pretty clear, right? There's Cide Hamete Benengeli, and Cervantes is accessing the texts of Benengeli, and in
Mm.
some sense, we don't really know, transposing them and editing them in the form of Don Quixote as we know it.
Mhm.
For those first 8 chapters, who is this? Where is the source coming from? Right? This is something that I find quite interesting, and it's an ongoing puzzle in Cervantes scholarship. That's a lot that I've left you there, but on those general lines, I'd like to hear what your thoughts are.
Um, so I mean, I think it is a mystery and it's like quite disorientating when you're reading it because I think like sometimes he talks about the second author and then he talks about this author which I think is the Benengeli is like the first named author that we have other than like the first person narrator. Um, I think. Is there a previous one?
I don't think there's any named narrator beforehand at all.
Yeah, so I mean, I think we just know that there's multiple according to Cervantes, and that he sort of numbers them, um, but doesn't name them. I think I sort of came in thinking that there was sort of too much intentionality with the writing, and then like I guess the tiniest details that feel like they get filled in, and that being done like way too consistently for it to feel like it was written by multiple different people. Um, but maybe that is like an editing process, and maybe there is like a an actual record that he's referencing. But I think I tend to think that he is the writer, because of the fine tuning of everything. Like I think the smallest details and the way those small details are incorporated. Like I mean that thing that you were talking about of this consistency of him doing something quite small that foreshadows a lot of what you can interpret the rest of the chapter to be about. Like that kind of nuance, I just wouldn't expect from like multiple different writers.
Yes, I think you're quite right there. Maybe I should also clarify that, look, unless maybe there are some literary theorists out there who I'd be giving a connuption to when I say this, but I mean, I think we can be pretty certain. Miguel de Cervantes historically, and of course now the problem
Wrote
is
it right. Okay, but then
we're invoking language that is a little bit anachronistic, right? But everyone I think watching this will understand what I mean. But historically, we know Miguel de Cervantes wrote the whole of Don Quixote. Cide Hamete Benengeli is someone he's made up, but
yes.
within the whole function of the story the question, of course, is like, who are the authors Cervantes wants us to believe have actually written this story? Um, who are the narrators Cervantes wants us to identify within the story is the bigger question. And your answer, of course, points to part of if we were to like start playing this game that Cervantes invites us into,
Mm,
your point is very correct, which is that if Cervantes really wants us to believe that he's done is he's just taken all these different records and he's put them together,
mm,
then what about all that internal consistency?
mm,
There's this whole problem. I will, of course, before I hand the same question over to Tudor, I will, of course, just point out that, look, one of the things that happens, it's pretty, I mean, anthropologically interesting and surprising that storytelling tends to be extremely consistent over long periods of time, and when over a diverse set of people recounting the same story. So it's often the case that by almost it seems like some kind of, for want of a better word, collusion, collaboration, stories that are written by multiple authors have a degree of coherence to them that
mm,
we, perhaps looking at them from the outside, could not actually possibly conceive could have proceeded from multiple different authors.
mm,
We need, or it's for us, the most simple explanation is that it's actually just one person guiding the whole process through. But sometimes you do get cases. For example, the Iliad and the Odyssey, unless I'm completely mistaken, our record of them is not based on any manuscript records. And if
mm,
and if our records of them are, those are manuscript records that are coming a minimum of like 800 years after the story was being told, right? Originally. So the point is that so the issue is that over millennia, right? That story has maintained a degree of consistency where you can see some degree of foreshadowing
mm,
even though it's actually had multiple recounters over time. And I would not be surprised that there's been a lot of innovation that's been attempted. Maybe it's been successful and maybe it hasn't, but that we actually,
mm.
unless you're an expert, you certainly can't kind of tease out what is innovation and what is original in that kind of corpus of work. Um, Tudor, I'd like to hear what your thoughts on this, like this problem of who the author and who the narrative voices belong to in Don Quixote.
Okay, so I think for me it's interesting. I think at the time, the first time I read Don Quixote, I was young, right? So it's a book that I read sometimes before going to bed, right? A bedtime story. And when I think of this notion of the narrator within the story, for me, it gives the same experience of having a bedtime story, right? And it's this notion of I am going to recount a story that I know, that I'm not the author of, right? So it's like you say, it's a very common story that when someone will tell you the three little pigs, the story of the three little pigs, it's not their story, but it's the story they're telling you of. And there's some history of other people who have told it and so on. So I think in this way, by creating this narrator, who's going to recount the story, almost like a bedtime story, he has this freedom in the same way that like one's parents would have to say, okay, it's like time to go to bed. I'm gonna end the story quicker than I should, or like have this flexibility of working within the story. Then there's this creation of this narrator who's recounting the story to give himself that flexibility, you know? And I think the perception I get is that oh, the story could have ended. We don't have any more information. It's time to go to bed, right? They were fighting and it's ended. But now, the next day, let's say before you're going to bed, then your parent would say, hey, but actually we found some information, some people, what. I've looked over some things, and I know the ending of the story now, and I can tell you the ending of the story. So I think it's interesting. He gives himself permission to tell the story and to feed the story. So it's sort of it's the only time I think I'm conscious of the author telling you that, hey, I am writing a story and I am choosing to tell you these things. And I'm admitting to doing that by having this narrator character I've created, right? What I think is interesting and my perception could also be a bit biased is that the narrator that Don Quixote that in Don Quixote that Cervantes is writing is sort of a metaphor for himself. That's my perception when I went over this chapter now. But I think it's interesting in that when he speaks about what he can trust and what he can't trust, right? It already, for me personally, casts the doubt within that narrator of what is truthful and not truthful. Because, like Kia brought up, the story is too consistent. And even the narrator at some point says, well, don't worry, our enemies, across the sea, they are going to say bad things generally about Don Quixote. So if they say good things about Don Quixote, it must be true, right? So it's sort of this play of like, if someone who doesn't like me wants to say these things, it's true, you know? So I think it's sort of a metaphor of like there's a narrator who's a metaphor for like Cervantes, and even within that, we can sort of have doubt within Cervantes, within the narrator, and within these other texts that he finds, you know? So I think in a way it's also he's just having a bit of fun with that because we don't actually know what he was thinking when he wrote it. But it's a interesting um interesting way of trying to identify what he would identify with and trying to see who, when we hear a story, who do we trust and believe as the owner of the story or the right telling of that story, right?
Exactly. And I think that your point is quite apt there, which is that though this is like a game in a way, this is a very Renaissance, very Baroque kind of way of seeing serious inquiry, right? There was this tradition almost of serious play in a lot of Renaissance and Baroque writing. Of course, Erasmus's famous Moria in Comium, in praise of folly, is an excellent example of this. There was this idea that sometimes in the joke, you know, a joke is really humor really is a way of juxtaposing things in such a way that you reveal some kind of hitherto unforeseen, well, yes, some kind of as of yet unforeseen link between them, right? So this is also kind of like what a pun does, is a pun links two things that usually wouldn't be linked. But in the moment that you get the joke, you realize that, oh, actually these two things are in some way much more similar than I'd ever thought before. And so there is an idea that there's no such thing, at least in the formalized literary conception of the time. There's no such thing as pointless fun, right? There's always some kind of higher purpose to humor in a way. Um, and so I think that's you're quite right that this is a joke, but it's a very serious joke in a way.
Mhm.
Um, and then I think you've got something that you'd like to say, Kia. Yeah.
I feel like I should, because I do sometimes get caught up in things, and then I think I'm like, wait, was it actually written by Cervantes, or was it like actually written by someone else? Yeah, I think I've done that to myself many a time. But like, I guess I felt like I should probably answer your question a little bit more directly in terms of
Please.
like
Yes.
inside the narrative, who does the narrator want us to think is writing, or is who
Who does Miguel de Cervantes want us to think the narrator is?
narrator is? Okay, so I think there's like a couple of things that he sort of drops in there that could be like breadcrumbs to who the narrator is. So like the one thing was I think he said they had to create scribes in order to like be able to follow Cervantes around in order to like know his innermost thoughts. It was like I don't know, like in that moment it felt like he had to be sourcing like literal sages or magicians who could read Cervantes's mind. I'm not Cervantes, Don Quixote's mind, in order to be able to write that history accurately. The other thing was that he's kind of racist towards Basque people and also Arabic people or Moriscos, I think. And so that makes you think he's probably Castilian, which I thought was an interesting thing to have that positionality kind of put. I know actually it's explicit that he's Castilian because he's trying to get things translated into.
Um,
I think he actually does say as a Castilian person.
I think he might.
Uh,
I don't remember. I don't know if he. Look, what he does say is that he lives in Toledo, and of course Toledo was ended up being under the Kingdom of Castile. Uh,
okay.
of course, even there's some degree of humor, of course, because the whole point is that he's referring to I mean, Toledo, of course, was where there was a famous translation school. So
Hmm.
that's kind of what part of this joke of him finding the text in
Oh,
Toledo and saying that he didn't struggle at all to find people to help him translate it.
oh, okay, cool.
Um, so that's just an interesting sort of historical aside. Um, I'm not sure if I'm really responding to your point here, but there's something else I wanted to bring in regarding the reliability of the author, but also this whole question of if we are to suppose, if we are to posit that what we have from chapter 9 onwards is essentially Cervantes looking at the text of Hamete Benengeli and just
Hmm.
transposing it or editing it in some way. The
Mm.
big problem, as you say, is the first is then where does intimate knowledge of character motivations come from, the
Hmm.
psychological state of characters come from, but then actually it gets even more like sort of basically empirical, which is that Cervantes explicitly states later on in the story, and I think this is in the second part, on numerous occasions, he says things like, our narrator or our author did not mention what kind of trees there were here, but I can assure you they were pine trees. Or he didn't mention what kind of bushes, flora there were in this particular area, but I can assure you they were X. And he does that at least twice in part two. So then the question is, where's he getting that information from?
Yeah.
Um, I mean, a bigger problem, of course, and we say a problem in a sense, but it's a bigger challenge for the reader to solve is even the whole existence of part two, because I mean, I would like to leave this to part two, but it's particularly relevant now, which is that you've got the whole situation where, if I may use the term historically, we know Don Quixote Part 1 gets published in about 1604, if I'm not mistaken, 1605 or 1604. It achieves enormous contemporary success.
Mhm.
And then, as was the norm at the time, another author continues the story with the second part, and writes under the pseudonym Avellaneda. And I can't remember what sort of the first name was supposedly of this Avellaneda figure. Cervantes is so upset by it that he then decides to write the second part. And then, of course, this is the whole question. If he's really consulting archives, why does he, why is he the one who makes the decision to write the second part when it suits him? You know, it's obviously, that's another part where, and he goes into quite a lot of work, I think, in the prologue to the second part, trying to explain away this kind of, it's not really a retcon in the modern terms, because it's not an attempt to kind of artificially maintain a suspension of disbelief. It's more kind of like an artful contribution to this already rather elaborate joke, right? Um, so I just mentioned that as a fact. I mean, that's something that I find endlessly amusing. So then we've got this other source of information that we have to posit. We've got some source of information that's going to provide us with the psychological state of characters, as you've mentioned, and also a source of information that is guaranteeing to Cervantes the specific details about like flora and fauna in part two. So that's all that I'm saying, just to kind of demonstrate how elaborate this joke gets. Um,
Mhm.
unless we want to move on to another particular topic, would either of you like to say more on this particularly, or introduce another related topic within this broader discussion?
Um, I guess the broader topic that I am sort of interested in, which I don't know if any of us would really be. I think you have like a decent history. I don't know how good my history of it is, but you were talking about puns, and where was I going with this? I forgot. Oh, so like I think the implication is like the face value rather implication is that the narrator is some kind of historian. Um, I think there's like this kind of conversation within the text that sounds pseudo-academic, but I guess there's also like this conversation that you're talking about prior to like what is being a historian at the time, which is an interesting thought to consider as well. But I guess what I got caught up in when I was reading it is like, what is the history of, and how is he portraying that history, particularly with like some of the political relations between different characters. And I was wondering, I don't know, I was wondering with the cutting in half like a pomegranate thing.
Yes.
I was like, that's such a weird thing. So then I was like, I wonder if that's how it's translated in Spanish exactly. Uh, and then I was like, okay, so I wonder if Granada is pomegranate. And then the first thing that comes up is Granada, the the place rather than the thing, which is in the like the bottom of Spain and also neighboring. Is it Morocco today?
Yes, yes, I suppose you could consider it sort of overseas neighbors, yeah.
So I was wondering if that pun is maybe a thing, is like cutting a pomegranate, but also cutting the place.
Yeah. It might be. It might be. I actually don't know. I mean, I'm not sure exactly why the pomegranate is named a Granada. It might actually just be because it's a fruit from Granada. But the question, of course, that you're making is Cervantes making some kind of like Reconquista reference or something, right?
Yes, yes.
I I don't know. I would think I'm tending to think not, just out of the sense that it's something that he doesn't, just because he actually seems like remarkably unconcerned or uninterested in the whole topic, by and large, uh, throughout most of his writings. Like there are some occasional references to, for example, the presence of Moriscos, who would have been Muslims who had converted to Christianity.
Yeah.
There's some reference to Hebrew, which he calls like the most excellent language, right? Which was a very like Renaissance, Baroque, medieval thing because there was this idea that that was the language Adam spoke, so therefore it must be the greatest language. Um,
Mm.
he has these kind of references, you're right, but unless look, maybe there are some academics that have done work on this. I'm not seeing like some kind of consistent image that he's developing throughout the story of relations between the different cultures that were in Spain at the time. So
Mm.
that's the only reason I would say it's not really something I can answer largely because I'm not actually that certain about what experts would say about Don Quixote in this particular respect.
And this, yeah, okay, fair enough. I think I was just like looking at this relationship with the Basque person and like the sort of metaphor of dividing um and having that division almost having occurred with the
Interesting.
pomegranate, then
That's
not having
actually
actually occurred.
the
And then all of these sort of relationships, like very explicitly between different people groups within the group, but not actually having them directly clash. So I think I wasn't thinking of it in like the direct reference sense, but more uh, an acknowledgement of how it had shaped culture thereafter. Um, but if there's not a lot of really smart people writing about it, then I assume it's probably not a thing.
Well, I think
Um,
there probably are a lot of really smart people writing about it, but now I get your point better. You are quite right that in a sense, part of this Cervantine realism is that he likes to depict people from different parts of Spain. So I think, is this the first time that we come across a Basque in the story? I think we might meet one earlier on. But it is true that we see almost these stereotypes, these kind of
mhm.
figures who stand in for their regions, and this even gets more the case in the second part, where I think they intend to travel to Barcelona, but they never actually, I don't think they ever ultimately reach Barcelona. I think they might go to Valencia. I'll have to remember exactly what the case is. But this is kind of what we see throughout. I'll have to confess my ignorance in the sense that other than some like really obvious things, like, a trope during the time was that if you find a merchant going down to Sevilla, it's usually a sign that they were in some sense engaging in illegal activity. That's kind of a trope that occurs at the time because Sevilla was this like booming export import city, and as often happens with booming cities, especially involved in trade, there's a lot of scamming going on as well, and that of course entered into the literature of the period as a trope that the person who is not from Sevilla, who's traveling from the rest of Spain to Sevilla, is almost always an untrustworthy character in some sense. But what exactly this means by, what beyond the immediately almost slapstick comedy of the Basque, Cervantes is actually trying to tell us, that's actually something I think it's there. There's some substance there, definitely.
Mm,
But it's just something I can't put my finger on. I couldn't provide a good enough explanation to it.
mm.
Um, And yes, so maybe what we'll do is before I hand over to Tudor. No, in fact, Tudor, I don't know if you have anything you want to say because I was thinking of introducing something else.
I think on that it's like Kia brings up a really good point of the fact that because I was reflecting now as well and also looking at like this like socio-political status of like Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. I think by using historical like a historical recounting of the story, it sort of allows him to have like a perspective where it's oh, this is an unbiased retelling of what's going on. You can see this is the social structure in the society. These are the people from different regions of the society. I'm just recounting it. So it allows him to illustrate some stereotypes, for example, as you say. But I think it's interesting because in a way we don't necessarily see him ever like there are moments where he like engages with it, but it's not like ongoing, like we're not being critical continuously while reading the work, right? So it's just thing that gets inserted in, and then you realize, oh wait, but this is a guy retelling a story about different people. Why is he going into detail about some stereotypes of certain regions, you know? So then we're critical, and then we're back into the story of the narrative of what's flowing. So I think it would be interesting. I haven't read as well. I don't know so much of the like understanding and unpacking the way Cervantes engages with identity and social class and um, immigration and in within his work, but he does. It's there. It is there. He brings it up. He writes about it. It is there. It just I don't know to what extent he works with it. Yeah.
Mm.
And it's important that we've raised this now because, of course, this is something again that becomes much more present
Yeah.
in the second part of Don Quixote. So it's actually something worth thinking of. I mean, I suppose what would we would have to do is pay quite a lot of attention to seeing how he treats different people from different areas, both within Spain and outside of Spain, to kind of see if we can't piece together some kind of coherent vision of what he's doing here because that the second part of Don Quixote is a lot more international in a sense and so would become particularly useful for us to pay attention to that but I'm actually glad you both brought that up because it's not something that was ever particularly at the forefront of my mind in reading this work. um, there's one thing that I'll mention, and maybe I'll mention it before we kind of finish off here, but this is I was reading something recently about Herodotus, who of course is considered sort of the godfather or the father of history writing. And of course what this particular author was, and I a big pardon because I don't remember his name. It was an article that I was reading. It was a journal article, which essentially argues that this whole idea of calling Herodotus, who wrote around the 400s BC in Athens, right? Uh, Herodotus was only a historian. He only became a historian really when 19th century historians looked to him as the originator of their discipline. Uh, if we actually try take Herodotus in a completely not anachronistic way, in a completely contemporary way, and try read Herodotus as Herodotus would have been read by Greeks of the time or Greek speakers of the time, and as perhaps even as Herodotus might have self-conceived his work, what we see is that he makes very little distinction between things that are clearly fables, like things that don't that, and it's not like we can the kind of the often the way that modern historians would explain this way is they'd say things like Herodotus he didn't really ever critically engage with things like, the giant ants that supposedly live in Libya. Okay, this ants the size of human beings that live in somewhere. I don't know if it was Libya. Um, and like then they just leave it at that and sort of I think the way almost the average reader would interpret this is thinking, haha, isn't it so funny? People back then were so silly that they really believed these things. The reality that we know is no one's actually that stupid. People
Mm.
just very rarely are that stupid. Herodotus, having never seen man-sized ants, would have probably at least thought a little bit about whether he should be writing about man-sized ants in his work, right? But the real solution to this problem is if Herodotus is a historian and he's writing about these fables, the real solution to that is actually that Herodotus wasn't a historian in the first place. He wasn't operating in the literary genre that we call history. He was actually participating almost in the same genre that Aesop did with his fables. But it was almost like taking the fables and sort of planting them within a world of of phenomena, events that the average person could factually verify through living memory. He would take these sort of stories and then put them in such a context as to explain why the Greeks were fighting the Peloponnesian Wars in his own time. And
Mm.
this is quite a long way that I'm going. I'm going about this in quite. I've become a bit long-worded about this, but essentially my point is that um, the idea that you don't include things that are fables, that are stories, fictional in our own terms, in a work of history, is something that actually isn't that long standing, right? It's more an idea of the last 200 to 300 years that we're. It's a conception of the last 200 to 300 years that tells us that these are two. This is like oil and water, and they can never be combined. I think we see that kind of concept of what history is here in Don Quixote. Um, it's also interesting context, by the way, that just before Don Quixote was published, there was the controversy of the Libros Plumbeos. And the Libros Plumbeos, I mean, I think it could have kind of be, it could sort of be translated as the copper books or something like that. Um, and they were actually a set of chronicles that explained part of the history of one area of Madrid. Or of central Spain. I'm going to look this up here so that I'm accurate when I say this at least. Uh, and they were widely believed to be true. Yes, if I'm looking here, they were the Libros Plumbeos del Sacromonte. And and it's one of the most famous examples of historical falsification, right? And essentially they they essentially sort of retold the story of parts of Granada, in fact. They told a history of Granada that actually turned out to be completely invented and in some sense, therefore, false, right? Uh, they were widely believed. And then when, humanists who had examined the text and sort of corroborated with other sources, so they already were seeing the beginnings of modern historiography already in the 16th century. They essentially debunked these libros plumbeos, and this caused a widespread distrust in historical texts as had been arrived as that had arrived at in the hands of the 15th century and 16th, well, rather 16th century reader. So even then, though we're dealing already with this kind of broader epistemological, philosophical controversy of the time, within that, there's already a controversy over what constitutes trustworthy history. And maybe in a sense, when I say a controversy about this is, and maybe I'm here kind of hypothesizing here, but my thinking is that people began to look at the way they wrote about the past in a very different way, which made the distinction between truth and historical fact, well, sorry, the distinction between sort of historical fact and historical falsity salient, and it was a distinction that just wasn't people it wasn't particular weight to people beforehand. And maybe I'm exaggerating it, but that seems to be the general trend that I see with the thinking about what history was at the time and with what we're actually seeing in Don Quixote. I would recommend anyone who's interested in this is to look at the work of Anthony Grafton, who wrote a book called What Was History, which was essentially about this whole question of why is it that we see in the 1600s and the 1500s this renewed interest and this renewed concern, or perhaps nascent concern and interest with supposed historical fiction and historical fact. Yes, Tudor. Sorry, do you guys have any questions about that? Because I didn't. I've gone on a little bit long with this particular point.
That's very thought-provoking. I think this idea of like separating fiction and fact, even if you are like creating a whole bunch of rules around that. And I think it does talk about some of like it does mention the rules and it's like you're not supposed to have and there's like this long list of things. It's like kind of relating to bias, strong opinions, strong love of these people when he's talking about the account from could you remind me his name? The
Sidi Hamete Benengeli.
yes, Miguel. Um, where he's like, oh well, he didn't his kind are the lying kind, but he didn't add lies, but rather he lied by omission.
Hmm.
And then the omission turns out to be that he didn't praise Don Quixote enough. So there is definitely this conversation, and it is very interesting to talk about the historical fictions in relation to things like bias and affect and omission and how close those things actually end up being together. So very interesting. Yeah, I don't know
Yes.
about
Well,
you.
what I'll do is I'll just add on two other things. So of course, this whole line of criticism, of course, is starts with the postmodernists. There's a postmodernist critique of history, and the postmodernists are essentially saying, look, when you are writing a history, because of the biases that you bring to a history, whether you're trying to deconstruct a previous narrative, or whether
Mhm.
you are trying to um, or whether you are continuing a previous narrative, those biases there structure the way in which you try and report the empirically proven facts in such a way that actually ultimately you're constructing a narrative there. What
Mm.
you're doing isn't that different from what famous historical novelists like I forget his name, Scott. What was his first name? He wrote so many of these. He wrote Ivanhoe. Uh, Walter Scott. So what you're doing maybe as Leopold Ranke isn't actually that different from what Walter Scott did, right?
Mm.
Um, so that's one important point, and that kind of generated a crisis within history departments across the globe as they
Mm.
try to respond to this question. Now, it's quite likely, as often happened, that the postmodernist critique went a little bit far in what it was actually saying, but there's still
Mm.
some kernel of valuable insight there. At very
Mm.
least, a kernel of valuable insight. And then the
Mm.
second thing I'd say is the curious point that you make there is that that quote where Cervantes describes the ideal historian is actually a quote from Cicero.
Oh.
And then, of course, you've got this question of if you look at Cicero's own context, I mean, Cicero was writing at a time when Roman emperors would they would torture facts to make them look like the most remarkable heroes of all time.
Mm.
Um, and I mean, Augustus did this to some extent. Julius Caesar in his De Bello Gallico and in his account of how he for the good of Rome and for his care for the Republic, he decided to invade across the Rubicon with his weapons and with his legions, right? So so Cicero's writing, he personally knew people who were taking accounts of their own campaigns and ensuring that the accounts of these campaigns were as flattering, were
Mm.
essentially like almost lives of the saints that would dominate in the Middle Ages as well, right? So it's interesting that even that tiny little quote has got so much history behind it and a lot of insight into what this peculiar but very valuable literary genre that we call history actually is or should be, you know. Tudor. Any thoughts? I think we might have to start moving towards the end of this because it was more of a theoretical discussion, as always this chapter was going to be.
Mm.
I think for me, what's quite interesting is to focus on this notion that in order for something to be true, factually, in a way, it has to be believable. And I think what Cervantes does is he's creating, similarly to how you said, if we write a fabled story, but we write a fabled story in such a way that there's giants and windmills and so on, that's not believable. But if I write about Don Quixote, who's losing his mind, who is going to fight these things, it becomes believable, it becomes factual. And I think that's sort of what he is beginning to play around with and unpack, you know, from this perspective of history, um, and how what is presented as history can be seen as true, but it isn't inherently true. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good point I think that you
Yeah.
make there because the remarkable thing about Don Quixote is that although it's supposedly a chivalric romance, also Cervantes explicitly and repeatedly terms it a history. I mean, this is actually an important thing, which is that any time that he refers to the way he identifies the work, it's never as a novel. Of course, the very term novel applied to this kind of literary genre takes only really occurs long after Cervantes is actually dead. But he never calls it a chivalric romance. He actually calls it a history, right? But of course, what we know as a fact through comparison with other texts is that he's trying to mimic and satirize the chivalric romances that were popular just before his own life, and but the complete absence of the supernatural in any or rather maybe not supernatural might not be the best example, but the complete absence of the fantastical, that's a better word, the complete absence of any fantastical elements is salient here because that's what the Arthurian legends are full of. That's what all of these other Amadis de Gaula and the Sergas de Esplandian, etc., were full of, but it's not in Don Quixote at all. So there's the strange thing of like there is the strange way in which truth is stranger than fiction in Don Quixote, right? Or truth has actually got more. This maybe we could finish off with this statement, which is that in Don Quixote there is more artifice behind seeming truth than there is behind obvious fiction, and that seems to be one of the mysteries of the whole work as an entirety. Some last comments from either of you. Anything that you really want to mention before we finish off here?
I think like I was definitely agreeing with what you were saying, but like beyond like artifice, like there's more magic in in like reality than is in fiction. Or I mean not in fiction, but I mean this is there is like this fictional element where there is this inclusion of magic as you try to figure out how the author could have known these things about a real person kind of thing.
Yeah,
Whereas like I was mentioning like the sorcery of being able to read Don Quixote's mind and have these intimate secrets and whatever. Yeah, that was my thought on that.
yeah, I like that. I think that's a very poetic way of putting it. Yeah. Um, Tudor, anything you want to say there?
Yeah, I think actually that's a similar thing for me as Kia is that sometimes when we need to create things and connect things using some sort of narrator, some sort of fiction, it becomes more believable. It becomes more true. Um, so I think that's what he's playing around with in this chapter. And I think that's also later on when we're reflecting on, wait, how true is what's going on in this point in the story? Because like things will get a lot more crazier later on in the novel. And when we're questioning reality, I think it's a good breadboard to reflect from or
Yeah,
saying, okay, what is true here? What is being like pulled in to make it seem true? And what do we want to be true as the person reading? Because we also have a thing we want, like personally, I want to believe the thing that is happening with Don Quixote. Cervantes writes in a way that he makes you want to believe it. He wants you to believe that it's true. And you can say, oh no, he's losing his mind. Of course, it's a history. It's not a chivalric romance, right? So yeah.
yeah. I'm always astonished at how like remarkable this work is. The fact that it's actually something like this has not been attempted since, at least not successfully since. It's pretty remarkable when you think about how much Cervantes is just condensing into this one work. And unless I'm ignorant, I can't think of anything that is of this kind of um, that condenses this much into one work. But unless anyone has anything last to say, I will finish. We will finish off here then. And so I'll say thank you very much to everyone who watched, and we hope to see you in our next chapter when we continue the story with chapter 10 of Don Quixote Part 1.